Hello, skeptics, and welcome to part 2 of To the Colonists, a letter from a liar. Our analysis of Peter Lawlor's famous, or perhaps I should say infamous, open letter regarding the Eureka Stockade. I'm going to pick up right where we left off 2 weeks ago, so if you haven't listened to part 1, you'll need to pause this episode here, and I will be waiting for you when you get back. If you're still with me, we pick up Lawlor's letter as he describes the stockaders' actions on the 2nd of December, which was the day before the attack, although, of course, they didn't know that at the time. An interesting fact about the famous stockade, it existed for less than 24 hours between being erected by the stockaders and demolished by the authorities. Few structures have lasted so short a time and had such an outsized impact on history. So, what does Lawlor have to say about this short-lived but ultimately immortal fortification? I quote, "The government have laid great stress on the erection of this enclosure and have dignified it with titles of stockade, barricade, fortified entrenchment and camp. It may suit their policy to give it these titles, but in plain truth it was nothing more than an enclosure to keep our own men together and was never erected with an eye to military defence." This is a claim that has been repeated everywhere since Eureka, not just by Peter Lawlor and the stockaders, but by historians too. The stockade was flimsy, poorly built, roughly made, badly constructed, weak, and the list goes on. But this doesn't make sense when you consider what actually happened when the military stormed it on Sunday morning. If the stockade was nothing more than a flimsy fence, as Lawlor and the others claimed, it would not have taken 20 minutes for professional soldiers to storm it. 20 minutes is a long time, especially if you're being shot at, and the soldiers' accounts of the stockade paint a very different picture to the structure of Lawlor's enclosure. Of course, some will argue that the military had a vested interest in saying the stockade was well built, because they were fighting for the government. However, regular British soldiers in 1854 were not ideological men, and most joined the army because it guaranteed wages, shelter, food and clothing, which I actually have to say is quite the indictment on the way that people were treated back then, rather than out of a love for king, country and empire. Most of those men in red jackets that morning couldn't have cared less what the government's aims were at the stockade, because their aim was simple: dismantle the thing, rout the rebels and go home with minimal losses. And then, hopefully, they might be able to get water and food and other essentials delivered to government camp, which the stockaders had been preventing from happening. With this in mind, they had no reason to present the stockade as being stronger than it was. It didn't matter what kind of barricade it was to them, they just had to get over it. If they could have kicked it down or jumped it easily, they would have. The soldiers at Eureka recalled having to climb the stockade, indicating it was too tall to jump over. And others noted that it was reinforced in some places and had pointed stakes coming out of it at angles, which prevented horsemen from clearing it. It had also been built with sight holes, so riflemen could fire at advancing forces from behind it without exposing themselves. Another important point regarding its construction is that it was musket-proof, meaning it provided very effective cover for the stockaders while they were firing at the advancing soldiers. Ultimately, it was a well-built, sturdy structure. It was certainly a long way from being an impregnable fortress, but that doesn't mean it was a fence that would blow over in a stiff breeze. It's also worth considering just who was inside the stockade. In his letter, Lawlor mentions that there were approximately 1,500 armed stockaders inside the barricade on Saturday. These were men who had elected to join the stockaders and believed they were ready and willing to lay down their lives for the cause. I say believed because, as we will hear shortly, it was one thing for the stockaders to talk about facing down trained professional soldiers and quite another to actually do it. However, also present in the stockade were a large number of civilians. The records are unclear on exactly how many, including men, women and children who were not involved in the movement, didn't want to be involved in the movement, but had found their tents and homes enclosed by the stockade. By Saturday, the stockaders weren't letting anyone in or out without a password, regardless of whether the people trying to leave were stockaders or civilians. The civilians, of course, didn't know the password, and so were trapped inside the stockade, something Lawler most certainly knew about. And part of the role of any commander-in-chief is to take steps to minimise the risk to civilians. Instead, he deliberately ignored their existence and forced them to remain in an extremely dangerous situation behind a barrier that had been built specifically to fend off a military assault. Now, it is also true that the officers of the military should have been more aware that there were civilians inside, and they are not blameless in the large number of civilians who were also killed during that assault. However, when the soldiers did storm that barricade just hours later, they had no way of knowing which men were stockaders and which were civilians, and so made an assumption which in the circumstances was not unreasonable, even if it was bloody and tragic, that any fighting-age male in the vicinity was a stockader, and a large number of the civilians inside the stockade were arrested and more than a few killed, along with many of the actual insurgents. And as always, in any battle, from a skirmish to a full-fledged war, innocent women and children were also caught in the crossfire. And I will not make any bones about the fact that the soldiers and police behaved with a vicious indifference to these people in the aftermath. Lawler says that the inhuman brutalities of the troops are well known, so he doesn't mention them in his letter, but I want to touch on this point because it's one that doesn't get a lot of attention in any of the histories of Eureka, with the exceptions being fantastic books by Gregory Blake and Claire Wright, which I highly recommend. Following the fall of the stockade and the retreat and capture of many of the stockaders, the soldiers and police did what soldiers and police have done since time immemorial and turned violently on the civilians still left inside the stockade. There is absolutely no excuse for their behaviour, which included theft from captured stockaders and civilians, the mistreatment of prisoners, and anecdotal evidence of sexual violence against many of the women whose tents had been enclosed by the stockade. By any modern understanding, these actions amounted to war crimes and people should have been held accountable, but no one ever was. However, that doesn't let Lawler and his stockaders off the hook. The military and police did not go on a mad spree around the diggings, looting, killing and raping anyone they came across, but restricted their inexcusable violence to within the stockade itself. This doesn't make it any better, but it does shine an uncomfortable light back on the stockaders, who had effectively imprisoned a large number of civilians within their barricade. You could almost suggest they might have been leaning towards using human shields. I am not saying there would have been no violence against the civilians had the stockaders allowed them to leave. We know this has never been the case in any conflict in the past or even today. But I wonder if it would have been reduced and if fewer civilians would have been harmed had the stockaders allowed them to go. After dismissing his stockade as nothing more than a fence, Lawler then proceeds to discuss what happened on Saturday. According to him, the stockaders spent the day drilling, procuring horses, arms and ammunition, and establishing patrols throughout the diggings. As mentioned last episode, anything the stockaders were procuring, they were stealing, and those patrols involved threatening people who weren't with them and occasionally taking prisoner people who told them to get lost and leave them alone. Lawler positions the drilling as mere practice, so the stockaders could defend themselves in case of an attack. He also says that at no point did the stockaders intend to stay in the stockade unless they were attacked. But this contradicts his claim earlier that it was just a flimsy fence. After all, why withdraw to a weak position? Yet, despite this, the stockaders did, in fact, stay in the stockade for most of Saturday, and it's the drilling I now want to focus on. Now, drilling in this case means practicing with weapons, with firearms, with pikes, and with other weapons that the stockaders had stolen or had themselves. Now, to Lawler and the other stockaders, it might very well have looked like practice to defend themselves. But to the professional soldiers looking on from government camp, remember they could see the stockade. All this drilling looked like practice to attack. And furthermore, who else could the stockaders be practicing to attack but the soldiers themselves? As discussed last episode, the diggers had been threatening to storm government camp, and now it looked as if they were preparing to do just that. So the longer the military waited, the more proficient the stockaders were going to become, and this undoubtedly influenced their decision to attack quickly. Before we examine that attack, however, or at least Lawler's interpretation of that attack, there is something that we need to know about the state of command inside the stockade at this time. Lawler was nominally the commander-in-chief, but as we've seen here and in last episode as well, he made little to no effort to control his men, and as the day wore on, this lack of discipline and structure began to tell. With nobody giving orders and the fiercely independent diggers disinclined to follow any orders they didn't like, such as orders not to leave their posts and continue their drilling, Raffaello Carboni, a very famous stockader who wrote a book about the event afterwards, tells us that the drilling ceased around 1 o'clock. The stockaders began to slowly drift back to their own tents, hungry and bored and looking for ways to escape the heat of the early summer day. By evening, the trickle of stockaders leaving the barricade had become a flood, and by midnight, when Saturday rolled into Sunday, of the 1,500 who had gathered that morning, only 120 to 150 were left, along with sundry uneasy civilians who couldn't leave because, unlike the stockaders, they didn't know the password to get out. Lawler says he doesn't know why they left or on whose authority they did so, but I think we can be fairly certain those men who left did so because they wanted to. It was one thing to march and drill and feel important in the daylight with numbers on your side, but it was another thing entirely to do so as night closed in. The men were tired, nothing had happened, and they expected if anything did, it would happen during the day, and there wasn't enough room for everyone inside the stockade. So they left. They went to bed in their own tents. Even Lawler decided he'd had enough of playing soldiers for one day and went to bed himself around midnight, although he claims he left his second-in-command, James McGill, in charge. There are 2 reasons why this is impossible to reconcile. First, given the general lack of discipline, it's perfectly obvious that no one was in charge of the stockade that night, and the stockaders didn't care if anyone was. The second reason, though, and I think the more important one, why McGill could not have been left in charge of the stockade that night, is because he wasn't there when Lawler went to bed. Lawler doesn't mention it in his letter, but earlier in the evening he had instructed McGill to take 200 heavily armed Californians, of which McGill was one, out of the stockade and onto Melbourne Road. There, on a narrow stretch of the road, which was little more than a dirt track covered in wagon wheel ruts, they were to ambush the military reinforcement column coming up from Melbourne. The reinforcements were 800 men strong, led by the highly experienced Commander-in-Chief of the Colonial British Army, General Sir Robert Nicoll, and they were bringing heavy artillery. McGill's men had orders to capture those guns if they could and prevent the reinforcements getting to Ballarat. This once again flies in the face of Lawler's claim that the stockaders were only ever defending themselves. Anyone with half a brain would have been perfectly aware that the soldiers, even if they were surprised by McGill's ambush, would not have given up their artillery without a fight. This was an offensive action and it would have resulted in huge losses on both sides. I have to say also that it would have been one thing for the stockaders to capture the artillery, another to get it back to Ballarat and use it successfully. That was always assuming the soldiers left it in working order if they had to retreat. Standard practice for British infantry at the time, if they had to abandon heavy guns, was to do everything they could to make them inoperable so their enemy could not turn them on them. So what was Lawler up to in his letter when he claimed he went off to bed and left McGill in charge? Well, first of all, he was maliciously maligning McGill's character by suggesting that he had been lax in his duties and was attempting to shift the blame for the attack onto McGill's shoulders and off his own. Secondly, he would have been aware that there was a lot of bad feeling in the colony towards the Americans who had been in the stockade, as a nasty rumour had been going around that they'd abandoned the stockaders on orders from their ambassador. Certainly, the American ambassador to Victoria was determined to keep his citizens out of trouble, and he put a lot of pressure on Sir Charles Hotham, and Hotham eventually bowed to it, to ensure that the white Americans who had participated were released without charge. The only known African-American rebel was the first man to go on trial for high treason in the aftermath. McGill was one of these white Americans who benefited from his ambassador's string-pulling, although he chose to remain in hiding at Port Nepean until the general amnesty was announced, even though he could have come out of hiding earlier. For obvious reasons, he didn't trust the Victorian governor's promises, even when they were conveyed to him through the American embassy. So why didn't Lawler defend his second-in-command from the rumours that he was a coward and a deserter? Well, we'll never know because Lawler never mentioned McGill again, but I think it was purely because Lawler knew it would have severely damaged his chances of being elected to Parliament if he had admitted to being involved in that episode with the Americans. Imagine how people would have reacted if he had admitted that he had sent 200 of his best men out to Melbourne Road on the eve of the attack, roughly 2/3 of his available fighting force. How would he have been able to justify his claims of his movement being entirely defensive if he had put in writing that he had sanctioned and ordered a violent assault on the government's forces? Remember, a lot of the public support the Stockaders had was because of the belief that they had been defending themselves. If Lawler admitted to authorising an attack and an ambush at that, quite a bit of that would have evaporated, and with it, his chances of being elected. It was much easier for him, and more in line with the public mood to which he was so attuned, to suggest that McGill had been nothing more than a negligent American and admit the fact that he, Lawler, told McGill to leave the stockade. This allegation actually had serious lifelong consequences for McGill, who was ostracised by the community, accused of being a deserter and a coward, and eventually died a destitute alcoholic. Peter Lawler never attempted to put the record straight, and all of McGill's attempts to clear his name and the attempts of his wife and children to assist him to do so were met with scorn. Now I think this is a good spot for a break, and I'll return with more of Peter Lawler's letter when I get back. Welcome back. You are listening to The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis, and we are examining part 2 of Peter Lawler's 1855 letter to the Victorian colonists. Before the break, Lawler had insisted he'd left his second-in-command, James McGill, in charge before he went off to bed around midnight. As we heard, this would have been impossible, given McGill was not in the stockade at midnight, having left earlier on Lawler's orders to ambush the troops coming up from Melbourne Road. So this then begs the question, who was in charge after midnight when Lawler went to bed? Not Lawler, as he is keen to point out, because he was asleep, and it couldn't have been McGill, because McGill wasn't there. Chances are that good old Captain Nobody was in charge between midnight and 3 a.m. The stockaders were actually incredibly lucky. Their sentries were die-hard converts to the cause because they seemed to have been the only men who remained awake and at their posts. So they had some warning when the military began to advance. Of course, Lawler was human and needed sleep, sure, but as Commander-in-Chief, he sure as hell also needed to have passed on proper instructions to his chain of command, although it is debatable if such a thing existed in the stockade, and he doesn't get to skip off merrily into the sunset an innocent man just because he was in bed when the first shot was fired. Lawler then goes on to discuss the opening of the stockade battle, or his version of it anyway. If you will allow me, I will quote. About 3 o'clock on Sunday morning, the alarm was given that the enemy was advancing, and I believe that 1 or 2 signal shots were fired by our sentries. On discovering the smallness of our numbers, we would have retreated, but it was too late, as almost immediately the military poured in 1 or 2 volleys of musketry, which was a plain intimation that we must sell our lives as dearly as we could. Lawler then goes on to claim that, to his great dismay, his men responded with fire of their own. He said he wanted them to wait until the soldiers were at a more optimum range before spending their bullets, because in his version of the stockade battle, and almost every version since, the stockaders didn't have much ammunition. Now, I'll come to this claim in a minute, but first let's examine what is probably the most controversial claim of the entire saga. Who fired the first shot? In every battle that has ever been fought between two opposing sides, especially between insurgent and professional armies, each side will claim the other fired first. The idea is to put your soldiers on the high moral ground by not having started the fight. Both Lawler and the military officer in command, a man called Captain John Thomas, said the other side fired first, but it is Lawler's claim that is often given the most weight. He certainly played to the colonists' sympathies, suggesting the stockaders didn't want to fight and would have retreated if they could, yet they found themselves surrounded and were immediately fired on. Oh no, what were they going to do? Well, given they'd spent the last 2 days stealing weapons, drilling with arms, and actively preparing for a fight, it was rather rich of Lawler to suggest that the stockaders didn't want one and would have avoided if they could. They'd effectively thrown down a challenge and the military had responded as militaries do. Now, I'm not going to go too much further into detail about who actually did fire the first shot. It's been very well researched and it perhaps needs an episode on its own, something to put away for another day. But for the purposes of examining Lawler's letter, I do wonder if it actually matters. Lawler was never going to admit the stockaders fired first, even if they did, because it would harm his defensive narrative. Also, given both sides were preparing for a fight, someone was going to fire at some point. No one had the high moral ground at Eureka, but everyone made choices in the lead-up that could have been different. It was not inevitable, nor was it the fault of only one side. And Peter Lawler, like everyone else involved, was not a blameless innocent, whatever he would like us to believe. There can be absolutely no doubt that these men wanted a fight, but they wanted a fight on their terms. And this is what sets these ideological insurgents apart from the professional military up in government camp. They were infatuated, as Raffaello Carboni put it, with the idea of a glorious battle in which the forces of right and justice triumphed over tyranny. In the stockaders' minds, they, of course, were the forces of right and justice. They were ready for a fight during the day. One of the stockaders' wives would later admit it, when their numbers were larger and they had all the advantages. They were so caught up in their ideas of glory that they assumed their perception of how a fight should go was the only way it would occur. They probably never even considered that the military wasn't an ideological force because they had projected an ideology onto them. The men in red jackets up in government camp didn't care how they won, they just had to win. So they needed to launch an attack at a time which best suited them when they had the advantage. The next part of the letter focuses on the number of stockaders, which Lawler claims consisted of about 70 men possessing guns, 20 with pikes and 30 with pistols. But many of those men with firearms had no more than 2 rounds of ammunition. The claim that the stockaders were poorly armed in comparison to the attacking military is one which has been made so frequently since Eureka that it's almost become fact, despite it not being supported by evidence except Peter Lawler's letter. The first thing you need to know is that a large number of stockaders who were captured threw away their arms before they were arrested because, at the time, being caught with arms in your hand was legitimate grounds to be shot on the spot. So many of those captured unarmed had been armed just minutes before. Remember too that the stockaders had been going around stealing as many guns and as much ammunition as they could get their hands on over the previous 2 days, and that guns were ubiquitous on the goldfields. The vast majority of the population owned at least one firearm and knew how to use it. Guns were needed, above all else, for self-defense at a time when police were corrupt and the roads were dangerous and you never knew who might try and steal your gold claim. With this in mind, I want to draw your attention to research conducted by the historian Gregory Blake, who has looked deeply into all aspects of the conflict at Eureka and has identified serious problems with the idea that the diggers were poorly armed. The Battle of the Eureka Stockade lasted about 20 minutes, from the moment the soldiers were seen by the sentries to the time the military were returning to government camp with their prisoners. As I mentioned at the start of this episode, 20 minutes is a long time when you are either shooting or being shot at, and it's very significant that the soldiers didn't breach the barricade until 10 minutes after they began their assault. At one point, the 40th Regiment even began to retreat in the face of what was very sustained gunfire from the stockade before their officers managed to rally them and continue the attack. At this point, Captain Thomas actually dismounted and moved to the front of his men and led them forward. As Blake points out, fire that is heavy enough to make professional infantry falter is not the work of a few poorly armed men. It's the work of well-armed men who know how to use their guns. Given the number of weapons stolen from around Ballarat, it makes sense that there were a significant number of firearms within the stockade and stockaders who knew how to use them. We also know that when the stockade was finally taken, and Peter Lalor doesn't mention this in his letter either, a large tent was captured in which there was a cache of arms and ammunition, which means the stockaders had more guns than they had men who could or would use them. They were not poorly armed by any stretch of the imagination, but Lalor is banking on two things when making this claim. One, that most of the public won't know about the arms and ammunition cache. The military called it the guard tent, and it wasn't mentioned during the treason trials, it wasn't relevant, but rather in government reports, very few of which were published. And two, that the public would be so enthralled by the desperate underdogs making a noble stand against overwhelming odds that they wouldn't think to question his account. Again, Lalor's writing this letter following a wave of public support for Eureka. He's actively shaping the narrative. This is the story he wants people to think of when he stands for election in a few short months. We're going to take another break here, and I'll be back with more right after this. And welcome back to The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis with Juliana Byers. After giving his version of events, riddled with inaccuracies as it was, Lalor then goes on to praise his stockaders for their courage and bravery in standing fast before the soldiers of the stockade was breached. Now, I agree with him here, absolutely. The stockaders were incredibly brave, those who remained to fight to the bitter end in particular. However, Lalor doesn't bring it up in his letter, but we know that the majority of the stockaders who had been present when the military was sighted were not there when the battle ended. Some were dead, of course, because that's what happens when insurgents take on professional militaries. But the majority of the others had decided that discretion was the better part of valour, as the saying goes, and had taken off into the bush. I don't blame them either, and I'd like to hope that some of the civilians they'd been imprisoning for the past 2 days managed to make it out too. Lalor's reasons for keeping this quiet, I believe, are quite simple. Last episode I talked about how Lalor wanted to suggest that everyone in Ballarat had been on his side, and apart from a few moral force men he dismissed as cowards, they were all supportive of his stand. We know they weren't, and that the portion of the population who were in favour of his course of action was actually quite small. Even if Lalor had mentioned the men who turned and ran, even if he dismissed them as cowards who had betrayed their oath, which they weren't, they were untrained insurgents whose natural instincts to save their own lives took over, he would have created an opening to pick apart his narrative. It served his purposes better for his reader to assume that all the stockaders who had remained behind that night, so those 120 to 150 or so men, had fought to the bitter end, even though in early 1855, when he was writing his letter, it was known this wasn't the case. But that there were contradictory accounts out there didn't affect Lalor, and with the exception of a single military report, he didn't mention any of them. He knew he had a good chance of convincing the public that his account was the most likely and truthful because he had been the commander-in-chief of Eureka. Someone in Melbourne reading his letter would likely assume that because of his position, he had an intimate and in-depth knowledge of what was happening in the stockade at all times. And it has only been within the last 20 years or so that Peter Lalor's truthfulness about Eureka has been questioned and his poor leadership put under a microscope. As we've seen over the course of these 2 episodes, he quite often had no idea what was going on and didn't want to know either. He had ideas and an ideology to serve, and when it came to presenting his case to the public, he made sure to ruthlessly discard or reframe any events which did not suit his ideological stand. Lawler then goes on to talk about the injury he received at the stockade, knowing that it would incite public sympathy like never before. Now, like his men, Lawler was no coward, at least not at the stockade. After he'd managed to wake himself up, remember he was asleep when the fighting started, and try to take command of the fight that was already underway, he remained in an exposed position trying to give orders to his men. As soldiers spilled over the barricade about 10 minutes into the fight and many of the stockaders began to run, Lawler remained at his post, and at this point he was shot in the shoulder. His arm later had to be amputated and he was hidden by some of his friends to ensure the police and the soldiers didn't find him as the stockade fell. He gives his life-altering injury only a passing mention, however, and focuses instead on the kindness of the people who helped him hide after his injury. Lawler probably really was grateful to these people. He would have died without their help, after all. And he remained on good terms with them for the rest of his life. But his behaviour after he was injured, and I'm not talking about the immediate aftermath, I'm talking about after he had effectively recovered and was no longer at death's door, was nothing short of contemptuous. He was treated quickly and spirited away to Geelong, where he remained in hiding for months with his fiancée. Instead of stepping forward to take responsibility and bear the consequences as his men had done, he skulked on the outskirts of the city until he knew it would be safe and there would be no consequences for him. It is this aspect of his behaviour, which he completely avoids mention of in his letter, that I find so despicable. He had spent 4 months composing arguments to put to a credulous public about how nothing that happened in Ballarat was his fault, while the men who he'd asked to die for him were rotting in jail, about to go on trial for their lives. It's revolting, and it was a strong indication of the kind of politician he became when he was elected in November 1855. Lawler then makes the contentious claim that most of the stockaders and civilians were killed after they had surrendered. As I discussed earlier, the military and police engaged in absolutely heinous behaviour following the fall of the stockade, up to and including the murder of civilians. None of the diaries of either stockaders or civilians who witnessed the aftermath make any mention of stockaders being killed once the stockade had been taken, except those who were still trying to fight. These included a pikeman who, despite having been shot through both legs, continued to swing his pike around his head until he was shot dead. Several stockaders were killed, but they were killed during the fight at the stockade, not afterwards. Lawler is once again appealing to public sympathy and playing to the popular prejudice at the time that soldiers in particular were bloodthirsty and brutish by nature. It's also worth pointing out that by the time the stockade had fallen and the prisoners were being rounded up, Lawler was hidden under a pile of slabs and on the edge of the stockade, semi-conscious from loss of blood, and wouldn't have had a clue what was going on around him. By April 1855, he would have heard the wildly exaggerated stories about the aftermath, and his claims that the troops engaged in inhuman butchery are based on these fanciful stories. As I said earlier, and I will reiterate again, I make no excuses for the war crimes committed by the soldiers and police against civilians in the aftermath of the stockade, and I applaud the officers, among them Captain Thomas and Captain Paisley, who took steps to stop this behaviour. But Lawler has no ground to stand on in claiming that the stockaders were killed after they surrendered. It's not supported by any of the actual eyewitnesses who gave coherent testimony or later wrote in memoirs, nor do the reports of several doctors and religious ministers in Ballarat who treated and ministered to the wounded and dying bear out this claim. It's also worth noting that there was no formal surrender at the stockade, but rather men surrendered or were captured individually. Quite a few civilians inside the stockade became caught up in this, as I mentioned earlier, and the police should have had to answer for arresting and, in at least 2 cases, killing people who had not participated and had simply tried to shelter their families when the bullets began to fly on both sides. Given the only reason these people were inside the stockade to begin with was because Lawler and his men wouldn't let them out, they are not blameless in regards to their deaths either. Lawler then goes on to say that the proportion of those killed or wounded was unusually high. He puts the total number of casualties, that is dead, wounded and captured, at 150. Now, we know from the records at government camp that 125 people, all of them men, were taken prisoner in the aftermath of the stockade. And we also know that not all of them were stockaders. Lawler would not have known this at the time, but he would have read the reports which were published in the newspapers while he was recovering from his amputation. Much of his knowledge about what happened after the stockade fell is based on these reports. Now, some of them, like the report about the arrest of 125 men, were correct, while others, such as one which claimed the soldiers had bayoneted every living man in the stockade, were provably false. Along with this number, that is 150 casualties, Lawler put the total stockader dead at 26. We know now that the dead were almost double Lawler's estimate, 60, including stockaders, soldiers and civilians, and up to 100 people in total, that is stockaders, soldiers, police and civilians, may have been wounded. Now, Lawler wouldn't have known these figures at the time, but in terms of total casualties, interestingly, he wasn't too far off. But where he was wrong was in suggesting that the number of casualties was unusually high. For a battle of Eureka's size, taking into account the weapons used and the number of combatants, it was actually fairly standard. If you'd like more information, I highly recommend Gregory Blake's To Pierce the Tyrant's Heart or Eureka Stockade, a ferocious and bloody battle. Now, both have the same content, but the former is illustrated. Blake gives a good summary of how to calculate casualty figures and compares those at Eureka with similar battles of the era. You'll recall that Lawler had never been a soldier, nor had he ever been involved in the Young Ireland movement or any anti-government agitation before. So he'd never seen the aftermath of a battle. He didn't even see the aftermath of Eureka, so had nothing to compare it with. And for someone who is not experienced in these matters, 150 casualties would seem horrifically high. Now I'm going to pause here for another break, and we'll wrap up our examination of Lawler's letter when I get back. Don't go anywhere, skeptics. This is The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis. In the final paragraph before closing his letter, Lawler briefly mentions the dispatches of Captain Thomas, the military officer who led the attack on the stockade. We've already discussed the controversy over who fired the first shot, so I won't go into that. But Lawler then makes a very interesting claim. I need to backtrack for a moment for you to make sense of it. Following the fall of the stockade, Captain Thomas sent a report to Sir Charles Hotham and Major General Sir Robert Nicholl, the latter being Thomas's commanding officer, regarding the military situation. Now, I'm going to look at this report closely in another episode, but what is important to know now is that Thomas claimed he had not acted sooner against the stockaders because at no point on the Friday or Saturday were they sufficiently gathered together in one area. This is a strange argument from an experienced military man like Thomas, and one that Lawler doesn't believe, and for the record, I don't believe it either, although it's probably the only thing Peter Lawler and I would ever agree on. Lawler writes that he believes the reason Captain Thomas waited to attack the stockaders on Sunday morning was because he was informed that there were very few of them and that they were not expecting an attack. The stockaders could see government camp and vice versa, so Thomas would have known that his forces were outnumbered on both Friday and Saturday. And he would have also seen the large contingent of heavily armed Americans leave to ambush the reinforcements coming up from Melbourne. There were also government spies in the stockade. Some were later identified, others simply vanished into history. And the stockaders knew they were there, they just didn't know who they were. Once Thomas was informed by his spies how few stockaders were left inside the barrier, that they weren't expecting an attack, and that the commander-in-chief was asleep and there was no one left in charge, he would have been foolish not to attack. The odds had gone from 5-1 against him that afternoon to 3-1 in his favour, and he had a highly trained force at his disposal. His job, after all, was to restore the conservative virtues of British justice as defined by his political masters. Lawler writes scathingly that had Thomas attacked the stockaders earlier on Saturday, he could have had the honour of capturing 1,500 of them rather than just 125. Once again, we see Lawler projecting ideology onto the military, and as I've mentioned a few times now, this was not an ideological fight for them. Thomas probably didn't care whether or not Peter Lawler thought he was honourable. He wanted to win, and he did so in undeniably spectacular, if rather brutal, fashion. Lawler then wraps up his letter with much poetic musing about why the government didn't move faster with its reforms, which is a valid point, but one that ignores all the progress that had been made before the physical force men took over the reform movement, which we discussed in detail last episode. He also made a very illuminating statement, which is not given enough focus when it comes to considering his motives. After repeating the old lie that the stockaders were forced to take up arms, he says that his second regret is that he and the stockaders were not able to win the day and give the government all it deserves and, in his words, punish its forces. This is the language of every extremist who has ever lived. Of course, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, as they say, and while Eureka was certainly not a terrorist attack, by the time the stockade was erected, it had moved past civil disorder and protest and was well into extremism. The government of the day was stupid. Its laws were out of date and they were dragging their feet because they knew they stood to lose their unearned privileges. But all of the much-needed democratic reforms would have happened whether the stockade had been built or not. Eureka was not the inevitable consequence of misgovernment. As I've said before, both sides had choices in the lead up to Eureka, and they knew it at the time too. They could have taken different paths, but they continued down their violent ones until it all came to a head. When Lawler was elected in November 1855, he briefly mentioned the Eureka Stockade and put forward one of the more stubborn myths of the affair, that without Eureka, democracy would never have arrived in Victoria. But think back to the beginning of episode 1, to the commission that was examining the conditions on the goldfields, that began sitting in November 1854 before Eureka was even a whisper. They saw the licence system was ridiculous and unworkable and only caused tension. They invited the diggers and citizens of Ballarat to give testimony, and many did. And one of their very early realisations was that many issues on the goldfields would be solved if the diggers were represented in Parliament. Also, very significantly, the Constitution of Victoria, which included manhood suffrage, was on its way to England to be ratified. Democracy was coming. It would have arrived early in the new year. And while I understand the frustration the diggers felt over their poor treatment and that they couldn't have known how soon this barrier was to be removed, it puts Lawler's claim, often repeated, into perspective. So, in the end, what did Lawler's letter achieve? Well, a great deal, actually, especially for the man himself. It presented Eureka as a heroic struggle, and Peter Lawler was its chosen leader, a man who had never wanted or sought power, but forced himself to wield it when others begged him to take up its mantle. I mean, what an origin story for a politician! That he lost his arm just added to his charisma and meant he sailed into his seat when he was elected and managed to remain in Parliament for 30 years. He switched seats once and he lost his seat once as well, but other than that, he had an uninterrupted parliamentary career. His mythos was built entirely on his actions at Eureka, which, as we have seen, were exaggerated, often to the point of falsehood, to present himself and his men as blameless innocents. In some ways, he reminds me of Ned Kelly. I think I may have mentioned this last time as well. Kelly wanted everyone to know that nothing he did was his fault and that he was forced to make the choices he did, and Lawler had a very similar attitude. Ironically, at the time Lawler was directing his men at the stockade, we think Ned Kelly was being born. Just a fun fact for you there. But when things went wrong for Lawler, when he discovered that he wasn't special or chosen or even a competent leader, he turned to the great political art of spin doctoring to make sure it was his story, his ideas, and his version of events that received attention. His letter is a manifesto, as I said last time, not an account of events, and it should be treated like any other document about Eureka, as a source, not the source, and his words should be treated with the same caution as those of any other historical figure. He knew what he was doing when he wrote that letter. He was, after all, a politician through and through. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis. New episodes are released every second Tuesday and available wherever you get your favourite shows. As always, if you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out on social media. I am Juliana Byers on both LinkedIn and Instagram, or find me online and check out my blog at www.skepticalhistory.com. That's skeptical with a K. Join me next episode for another skeptical take on the mystery that is history. And stick around after the credits if you want to hear the full text of Peter Lawler's letter. Bye now. The Skeptical Historian is researched, produced and hosted by me, Juliana Byers. You can find a full list of resources used in my research by going to my rss.com podcast page, clicking on the relevant episode and opening the transcript before scrolling down to the sources section. That's www.rss.com/the-skeptical-historian. Our sound effects are by Adobe Creative Cloud, Pixabay and Epidemic Sound, used under the appropriate licenses. The music track The Whistle Funk by Telsonic was also used under this license. Podcast hosting is by rss.com. See you next time, skeptics. Peter Lawler's letter to the colonists. On Saturday morning, we commenced to muster at Eureka about 8 o'clock. Well-grounded fears being entertained that government spies would mix with the volunteers and betray their movements, and it also being found necessary that a distinct place should be marked off in which the men could muster together and be drilled. A piece of ground at Eureka was enclosed with slabs for that purpose. The government have laid great stress on the erection of this enclosure and have dignified it with the titles of stockade, barricade, fortified entrenchment and camp. It may suit their policy to give it these titles, but in plain truth it was nothing more than an enclosure to keep our own men together and was never erected with an eye to military defence. The remainder of the day was spent in further drilling, procuring horses, arms and ammunition, and establishing patrols throughout the diggings. Mr. McGill, having been recommended to me as a person possessing military knowledge, I entrusted him with the military arrangements. On Saturday evening, there were about 1,500 men in the enclosure, ready and willing to use their arms in defence of their rights. It is of importance to observe that we never contemplated remaining within the enclosure till attacked. We had scouts and sentries throughout the diggings for the purpose of giving us information of any movement on the part of the force at the camp, so that we might have it in our power to arrange our future movements. About 12 o'clock I retired to bed, leaving Mr. McGill in charge. At this time, the majority of the men were still in the enclosure. Shortly after this, a false alarm was given, which was soon succeeded by another. On the third and real alarm being given, only about 120 men were present in the enclosure. From what cause or by whose orders the others had left, I cannot say, but I feel certain they intended to return next day. Before going to bed, I had given permission to only one company of 70 men to leave. A great portion of this body had been on duty for 36 hours previous and were unable to find tent accommodation within the enclosure. About 3 o'clock on Sunday morning, the alarm was given that the enemy was advancing, and I believe that 1 or 2 signal shots were fired by our sentries. On discovering the smallness of our numbers, we would have retreated, but it was then too late, as almost immediately the military poured in 1 or 2 volleys of musketry, which was a plain intimation that we must sell our lives as dearly as we could. There were about 70 men possessing guns, 20 with pikes and 30 with pistols, but many of those men with firearms had no more than 1 or 2 rounds of ammunition. Notwithstanding all those deficiencies, I cannot speak too highly of the conduct of the men present. Their coolness and bravery were admirable, and when it is considered that the odds were 3 to 1 against us, and that, owing to the carelessness or mismanagement of the outpickets, we were really surprised, it must be evident that most of those who were present did their duty. As the inhuman brutalities practiced by the troops are so well known, It is unnecessary for me to repeat them. About 10 minutes after the beginning of the fight, and while standing upon the top of a hole, calling upon the pikemen to come forward, I received a musket ball, together with 2 other smaller bullets, in the left shoulder, which shattered my arm, and from the loss of blood, I was rendered incapable of further action. Soon after, I was assisted by a volunteer out of the enclosure and placed in a pile of slabs out of view of the military and police. While in this position, the latter passed several times within a few feet of me. I remained there about an hour when, thanks to the assistance of some friends, I was enabled to leave it, the police and military having returned with the prisoners, and find my way to the bush, where I remained during the day. On the approach of night, I returned to the diggings, and through the kindness of a friend, procured the assistance of surgeons, who next day amputated my arm. In the attack, or rather after the surrender of the insurgents, we killed 14 men and wounded 20 men, of whom 8 have since died. I attached the names of those killed and wounded, so far as I could learn. Powell and Rowlands were killed near their own tents. I do not include their names in the list of killed because they never had anything to do with the movement. The unusual proportion of the killed and wounded is owing to the butchery by the military and troopers after the surrender. The number of killed, if added to the number of prisoners taken to the camp, together with the few who escaped, may be fairly conjectured to the amount of about 140 or 150 men. It may, therefore, appear that my return of 120 men in the enclosure at the time of the attack is incorrect, but this apparent discrepancy will be readily understood when I state that many were taken prisoners who were not in the ranks of the insurgents. Even some of the state prisoners were not in the movement at all. I must now call your attention to the dispatches of Captain Thomas. In one piece, he states that the insurgents fired the first volley. In another, he states that he would have attacked us before, but that there was not a sufficient number of insurgents in one place until the time he made the attack for him to strike a decisive blow. I regret to contradict the first of these statements point blank. The military fired the first volley, which one company of insurgents returned much sooner than I wished, as I had directed all, except the rifles, to reserve their fire until the enemy should arrive within 15 yards of them. I do not believe Captain Thomas's assigned reason for not attacking us before, because I knew he could see from the camp 500 men on Bakery Hill on Thursday evening and 1,500 on Friday morning. He could have had the honour of crushing the same number by attacking any detachment during Saturday, because the party attacked would have been supported. I believe that Captain Thomas's reason for attacking us on Sunday morning was because he was informed of the smallness of our numbers. The source whence he derived the information has yet to be discovered. I have no doubt that our numbers would have amounted to 1,500 on Sunday morning, before 7 o'clock, had we not been attacked. I must here state that there were only about 30 foreigners in the movement. Quick author's note from me, Juliana. The authorities blamed foreigners for the unrest at Eureka because it suited their narrative to believe that good British subjects would never do such a thing. That's why Lawler's making this statement here. We now return to the letter. There are 2 things connected with the late outbreak which I deeply regret. The first is that we should have been forced to take up arms at all. The second is that when we were compelled to take to the field in our own defence, we were unable, through want of arms, ammunition, and a little organisation, to inflict on the real authors of the outbreak the punishment they so richly deserved. From the steps now being taken by the government, I have no doubt but that we shall have many measures of useful reform carried into effect. Why were not these measures adopted before? Why did not government take steps to alter the land system, to amend the mode of collecting the gold revenue, and to place the administration of justice in the hands of honest men before this bloody tragedy took place? Is it to prove to us that a British government can never bring forth a measure of reform without first having prepared a font of human blood in which to baptise that offspring of their generous love? Or is it to convince the world that, where a large standing army exists, the demon of despotism will have frequently offered at his shrine the mangled bodies of murdered men? Whatever may have been the object of our rulers in adopting the line of policy they have pursued, the result has been deplorable, and such, I hope, as a civilised people will never again have to witness. I trust that from the facts I have stated, that it will be evident that neither anarchy, bloodshed, nor plunder were the objects of those engaged in the late outbreak. Stern necessity alone forced us to do it. I am induced to call your attention to this subject because I am aware of the calamitous insinuations thrown about by some of our enemies, especially by one from whose station a more honourable and dignified course might have been expected. Another quick author's note. This is a reference to the governor. Returning now to the letter. Those insinuations were made at a time when 13 men had to be tried for their lives for being concerned in the outbreak. I may here add that I have taken measures to have the history of the outbreak and its causes brought before the House of Commons in order that the real authors of the bloodshed may be brought to trial. Should I, from any untoward circumstances, be unable to prosecute this measure, there are numbers ready and willing to come forward to prove the facts I have stated. I have the honour to remain, fellow colonists, your obedient servant, Peter Lalor. The following lists are as complete as I can make them. The numbers are well known, but there is a want of names. I trust that the friends or acquaintances of those parties may forward particulars to the Ballarat Times office to be made available in a more lengthened narrative. Killed: John Hines, County Clare, Ireland. Patrick Gittins, Kilkenny, Ireland. Mr. Mullins, Limerick, Ireland. Samuel Green, England. John Robertson, Scotland. Edward Thonian, the lemonade seller, from Prussia. John Hefale, Wartenberg. John Diamond, County Clare, Ireland. Thomas O'Neill, Kilkenny, Ireland. George Donaghy, County Donegal, Ireland. Edward Quinn, County Cavan, Ireland. William Quinlan, Goulburn, New South Wales. 13 and 14, names unknown. One was usually known on Eureka as Happy Jack. Wounded and since dead. Lieutenant Ross, Canada. Thaddeus Moore, County Clare, Ireland. James Brown, Newry, Ireland. Author's note. This man was a particular friend of Peter Lalor. We return to the letter. Robert Julian, Nova Scotia. Mr. Crow, from an unknown location. Mr. Fenton, location also unknown. Edward McGlynn, Ireland, and an unknown man who is listed as no particulars. Wounded and since recovered. Peter Lalor, Queen's County, Ireland. Name unknown, England. Patrick Hannafin, County Kerry, Ireland. Michael Hanley, County Tipperary, Ireland. Michael O'Neill, County Clare, Ireland. Thomas Callanan, County Clare, Ireland. Patrick Callanan, brother of the above, County Clare, Ireland. Frank Simmons, England. James Warner, County Cork, Ireland. Luke Sheehan, County Galway, Ireland. Michael Morrison, County Galway, Ireland. Dennis Dinan, County Clare, Ireland.